Troy Blackstone had always flourished in the shadows. For over 15 years he'd built a career on discretion, deception, and the art of extracting secrets. As a security consultant with a focus on corporate espionage and private investigations, he had long understood one truth better than most. In this world, information wasn't just power, it was the only currency that truly mattered. What he never anticipated was that his most vital assignment would involve unearthing the truth about his own wife. The brownstone in Brooklyn Heights had once symbolized everything he and Diana dreamed of building together. They'd purchased it 8 years ago, drawn in by its classic exposed brick walls and the breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline. Diana had fallen in love with it instantly. But now, as Troy sat alone in the dim light of his basement office, surrounded by glowing monitors and a maze of surveillance feeds, those same walls felt like they were closing in on him. What had once been a sanctuary now resembled a cage of his own making. Diana Blackstone, formerly Deanna Harrison, had once been a force of nature, a high-powered real estate developer with an impeccable sense of style. Her platinum blonde hair and striking emerald eyes made her unforgettable. She had a presence that could stop a room cold, and a charm that could make skeptics hand over their trust. They were married within months, and for a while Troy genuinely believed he had found his forever partner. 3 years into the marriage, they welcomed twins, Connor and Madison, who quickly became the epicenter of Troy's universe. Now 8 years old, Madison had inherited her mother's effortless beauty and her father's razor-sharp mind. Connor, on the other hand, possessed a quiet, soulful creativity that reminded Troy painfully of his younger brother, who had been killed in action in Afghanistan. Those children were his anchor, his everything. But 6 months ago, the perfect facade began to crack. It started with a routine security sweep of their home's network, something Troy did periodically without thinking. Only this time, he discovered encrypted financial transfers, hidden hotel reservations under Diana's maiden name, and a string of communications cloaked behind layers of obfuscation. The moment of realization hit him like a gut punch. But Troy was a man who had long ago learned to compartmentalize pain. Instead of crumbling, he went to work. Blake Hoffman was Diana's business partner at Harrison Hoffman Development, the company they had built from the ground up over the last 5 years. Tall, charming, and disarmingly likable, Blake had a way of making even the most frugal investors throw caution to the wind. He was often at their dinner table, laughing with the kids, sipping wine with Diana. Troy had even thought of him as a friend. That made the truth hurt even more. Blake and Diana had been having an affair for 2 years. Troy didn't react impulsively. He responded the only way he knew how, with methodical precision. He installed covert surveillance in Diana's office. He tracked their financial records, uncovered joint accounts opened without his knowledge. He decrypted their messages. What he found wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. A deliberate, coldly executed plan to erase him from Diana's life entirely. The damning evidence was on Diana's laptop, one she had foolishly assumed was impenetrable. In one message, Blake had written, "The prenup won't matter if we can prove he's been using company assets to fund his surveillance firm." Diana's reply had chilled Troy to the bone. "Connor and Madison barely know him. He's always working, always away. We'll make sure they understand he chose his job over his family." Troy read those messages repeatedly, each time feeling the weight of their betrayal pressing deeper into his chest. They weren't just leaving him, they were engineering his destruction. Diana wanted full custody, the house, the reputation. Blake would walk away with the woman and the empire. But they had miscalculated one thing. Troy Blackstone was not a man who went down quietly. For the next 4 months, Troy plotted his counterattack. He quietly liquidated assets they didn't know existed. He moved funds into foreign accounts under shell corporations, and most importantly, he began investigating the Harrison family with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to every professional case. Diana's mother, Gregory, owned a sprawling chain of upscale hotels along the East Coast. They had always treated Troy like an interloper, some blue-collar charity case who got lucky with their daughter. What they didn't know was that Troy had grown up in the foster care system after his parents died in a car crash when he was 12. He'd clawed his way up from nothing, fueled by one belief: the world was full of predators, and he refused to be anyone's prey, ever again. His breakthrough came when he began digging into Patricia's judicial history. In old, sealed court records, he unearthed a case from 13 years prior. A drunk driving incident had killed a family of 3. The driver, a wealthy businessman's son, had received a shockingly lenient sentence, community service and probation, despite being over 3 times the legal limit. The presiding judge? Patricia Harrison. Shortly afterward, the businessman donated a substantial sum to Patricia's re-election campaign. The plot thickened when Troy discovered that the same businessman was Gregory Harrison's longtime business partner, and the victims? The Moretti family, Italian immigrants who had owned a small construction firm bidding against Harrison Development for a multi-million-dollar city contract. Troy now held a nuclear option one that could bring the Harrison dynasty crashing down. So when Diana's attorney, Lawrence Kemper, arrived at Troy's office with the divorce papers, Troy was more than ready. Kemper, smug and perfectly groomed in his designer suit, delivered the paperwork with a sneer. "She gets everything," he said. "Even full custody. Your own children don't want your name anymore." Troy didn't flinch. His office radiated quiet professionalism. Awards on the wall, framed photos with law enforcement dignitaries, the veneer of success carefully maintained. Without a word, he reached into his drawer and handed Kemper a sealed envelope. "Give this to your client," he said calmly. The smirk on Kemper's face faltered. "What is this?" he asked. "Insurance," Troy replied, cool as ice. That evening, Troy's phone rang off the hook. The first call came from Diana, her voice shrill and frantic. "What the hell did you do, Troy? What are you trying to pull?" He didn't answer. The next call was from Blake, his tone a mix of fury and fear. "You think you can blackmail us? This is extortion." Troy leaned back in his chair, watching the monitors in his office flicker softly. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Troy didn't bother listening to the entire voicemail. He deleted it halfway through. Her panicked screams were nothing more than noise. The third call came at 11:47 p.m., and this time the caller wasn't Deanna or Blake. It was Patricia Harrison. Her voice, when it came through, was cold as steel, but beneath the polished outrage, Troy heard something unexpected, something unfamiliar. It was fear. "How could you possibly know about something buried for 13 years, she demanded, her composure cracking. "You answer this call right now." Troy picked up. "Good evening, Patricia. I was wondering when you'd finally call." "You bastard," she hissed. "What do you want from us?" "Justice," Troy replied evenly. "Something I know you've never had much use for." Inside the envelope he had given Kemper were copies of sealed court transcripts, financial documents, and damning photographs. Together, they told a story of a conspiracy that had resulted in the wrongful deaths of an innocent family and the illegal enrichment of the Harrison empire. A story that could not only end Patricia's career, but also place her in a federal penitentiary. "You can't prove anything," she said, though her voice faltered. "I can prove everything," Troy replied. "I have bank transfers from Harrison Hotels to your re-election fund, untraceable to most, but not to me. I have records of the Moretti family's construction bids being denied after the accident. I have photographs of you and Gregory clinking champagne glasses at the country club 3 days after you let a killer walk free." There was silence, a long, heavy pause. Then Patricia asked, "What do you want?" "I want Diana to withdraw the divorce petition," Troy began, his voice measured. "I want Blake to sell his half of the company to a shell corporation I control. Deanna gives me full legal custody of the children, and she exits their lives permanently. And you? You resign from the bench in disgrace." "That's impossible," she snapped. "Deanna will never agree to that." Troy cut her off. "Diana will agree, because the alternative is her mother going to prison and her father's hotel empire collapsing under federal investigation. Because the alternative is the Morettis finally receiving justice and the Harrison name reduced to a cautionary tale in every ethics textbook. You're destroying an innocent family." Troy's laugh was low, cold, and devoid of mirth. "Innocent? Your daughter and her lover plotted to steal my children and obliterate my life? Your family made its fortune by burying the truth, by literally burying a family in the ground and dancing on their graves. Don't talk to me about innocence." Over the next week, Troy watched as the machine he'd constructed with surgical precision came to life. Deanna resisted at first, still believing that the influence of the Harrisons could shield her. Blake, desperate, hired private investigators to dig into Troy's past, hoping to uncover skeletons. But all they found was a curated history of resilience, a foster kid turned respected businessman with a spotless record and decades of goodwill from law enforcement. Then came the real pressure. Local journalists, tipped off anonymously, began sniffing around the Harrisons. Questions about judicial impropriety, campaign finances, and old verdicts were whispered in newsrooms and shouted across airwaves. Federal agents, armed with subpoenas and search warrants, raided Harrison-owned hotels, collecting hard drives and financial ledgers. Diana's defiance finally cracked when those agents arrived at her father's corporate headquarters. Blake's bravado disintegrated even faster. He realized far too late that going to war with Troy meant fighting someone who made his living by uncovering and weaponizing secrets. And Troy knew everything, every backdoor deal, every fraudulent invoice, every favor traded for influence. The final confrontation occurred in a sterile oak-paneled conference room. Diana's attorney, Lawrence Kemper, looked like a man on the verge of collapse. His sharp suit hung off him like armor he no longer believed in. Diana sat stiffly, her face pale and drawn. Blake wasn't present. His legal counsel had strongly advised him to put as much distance between himself and the Harrisons as possible. "You've won," Diana said, barely above a whisper. "We'll sign whatever you want." Troy studied her for a long moment. Gone was the confident woman who once commanded boardrooms and brokered million-dollar deals. In her place was someone hollowed out by defeat. "I want to hear you say it," he said. "Say what?" "That you never loved me, that this entire marriage was a lie, that you planned to take my children and burn down my life." Her expression twisted into something venomous. "You were never good enough for me, Troy. My parents knew it from the beginning. You were nothing, just some orphan kid with delusions of grandeur." Troy didn't flinch. "And yet this orphan just dismantled your entire legacy." He slid a new set of documents across the table. "The prenup is meaningless now. You're signing this instead. You keep your personal effects in a small trust fund, barely enough to survive, certainly not enough to rebuild. Blake's shares in Harrison Hoffman are being transferred to me. You will waive all parental rights and only see the children under supervision. Permanently." Diana signed each page mechanically, as if each stroke of the pen drained a part of her soul. "The children will learn the truth one day," she said quietly. "Yes," Troy said. "They'll learn that their mother abandoned them, that she chose a lie over her family. That's the truth that matters." As he collected the signed papers and prepared to leave, he turned one last time. "There's one more thing you should know." She looked up, wary. "Blake isn't disappearing because I forced him to. He's gone because 3 days ago he transferred everything, his money, business assets, even his personal accounts, to a company in the Cayman Islands and bought a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country." Her face went slack. "No, he wouldn't. Blake loves me." Troy laid a photograph in front of her. It showed Blake at JFK Airport, his arm around a dark-haired woman Diana had never seen before. "Her name is Miranda Walsh, his girlfriend of 6 months. He was playing both of us. He planned to vanish with her as soon as the divorce was finalized." Diana stared at the image, her world shattering for the second time in a single week. "The difference between us," Troy said, voice level, "is that I never trusted him. I investigated everyone in your life, including your lover, and when I found out what he planned, I made sure he couldn't do it. With your money." She was silent, stunned. Troy then produced a second photo, screenshots of Blake's accounts being drained, the transfers logged, the destination unmistakable. He left the room without another word. "He left you to face the consequences alone," Troy said, his voice flat. "Just like you and he planned to leave me." As he turned and walked toward the door, Diana's facade finally shattered, her voice cracked under the weight of desperation. "You can't take my children, they're mine." Troy paused in the doorway, slowly turning back to face her. His expression was like sculpted granite, unforgiving and resolute. "You lost that right the moment you decided to use them as pawns," he said. "Connor and Madison deserve more than a mother who sees them as leverage. Maybe one day they'll hate me for this, maybe. But they will never, ever doubt that I stood up and fought for them." 3 months later, the chill of fall crept through Brooklyn, but inside the Blackstone residence, warmth endured. Troy sat at his home office desk, gaze drawn out the window. In the backyard, his children were playing, Connor, glove in hand, coaching Madison on how to throw a baseball. Her throws were wild, exaggerated, but her laughter rang out pure. Connor doubled over laughing, encouraging her again. They had adjusted to their new life in a way only children could. With resilience, with curiosity, with love. They didn't need the details. All they understood was that their father was there every day, and their mother wasn't. Patricia Harrison, once a respected figure on the federal bench, had stepped down amid a firestorm of scrutiny. Under the looming weight of a federal investigation, she'd accepted a plea deal that spared her prison, but not her reputation. House arrest became her new normal, along with a bitter taste of disgrace. Gregory Harrison's once mighty hotel empire stood frozen in time, his accounts locked pending outcomes of the civil lawsuits filed by the Moretti family's surviving kin. The same family he once tried to erase from the map was now dragging his legacy through court, with the full force of the law behind them. Diana had vanished from the social circles and power plays that once defined her. The last Troy heard, she was working as a junior agent in a small real estate firm in New Jersey, anonymity forced upon a woman who once dreamed of ruling skylines. Blake Hoffman had, indeed, left the country, but not before Troy's network of global operatives seized what assets he'd squirrel away. Offshore accounts were emptied, real estate titles revoked. In a calculated stroke, everything Blake had stolen was returned to those it belonged to. He hadn't just fled justice, he'd been stripped of his stolen spoils along the way. Troy's phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. He looked down at the caller ID and recognized the number, not a friend, but a name he'd seen in the research files earlier that week. "Another client, another case," he answered. "Blackstone Security." A soft, nervous voice came through the line. "Mr. Blackstone, my name is Amanda Richardson. I think my husband is planning to kill me." Troy's hand reached for a pen, flipping open a fresh page in his leather-bound notepad. "I'm listening, Mrs. Richardson," he said calmly. "Start from the beginning." As her voice began to explain the shadows in her life, the deceit, the subtle threats, Troy leaned back slightly, his eyes once again drawn to the backyard. Connor was now trying to teach Madison how to catch. She kept missing the ball, but every time she dropped it, she laughed harder. Their laughter drifted through the window and filled the room with life. It reminded him this was what he was fighting for, this was what mattered. In his world there was always another client, another betrayal, another predator who believed they could harm with impunity. But Troy Blackstone had spent his entire life disproving that belief. From his youth in the foster care system, where kindness was rare and weakness meant pain, to the battlefield, where survival depended on how quickly one could assess threats, to his marriage, where he learned that betrayal doesn't always wear a stranger's face. Every chapter of his life had forged him into what he was now. A man who didn't show mercy where none was deserved. A man who understood that to survive, to protect what matters, you had to fight harder, smarter, and without hesitation. He'd lived by one rule. Those who show mercy to the merciless are doomed to fall by their hand. Troy had never made that mistake. And he never would.